When I originally came up with the idea of starting up a gaming review channel, I had a handful of games I wanted to talk about. Unfortunately, that went out the window when life got in the way, and I also happened to lose the footage I planned on using for reviews. For the most part, I'd say that nothing of great value was lost, so rather than trying to replay the games I planned on reviewing, I figured that I'd be better off moving forward with a new plan and games to cover. That applies to around 95% of the games that I planned on reviewing, but with Cuphead, things were different. It's not only because I greatly enjoyed Cuphead when I originally played it back in 2017, but also because enough time had passed since then. On top of that, I now have an active gaming review channel, so the more games I have to review, the better off I'll be. I already had enough notes to write up a review for Cuphead, and I genuinely wanted to play through it again, so it didn't take much for me to get to work. I want to say that this speaks volumes in regards to how I feel about Cuphead. Simply put, I think Cuphead is a great game that offers enjoyment in more ways than one, and it's worth replaying. What actually supports how I feel about Cuphead is the fact that even when it was infuriating to get through, I still thought so highly of it that I didn't mind replaying it 4 years later. There are some games that I replay on a regular basis, but those are the ones that greatly impacted me during my formative years. For a game to do that nowadays, it's either really special or it's simply well made. For me, it's clear that Cuphead is a game that's both special and well made. The bulk of that is due to its gameplay, which I'll eventually cover throughout this review, but from the start, what really grabbed my attention was its art style and overall visuals. When it comes to animated works, there are all sorts of things that you can focus on to decide whether or not it's high quality work, or if it's simply something that you enjoy. With Cuphead, it's both things. Besides the animation that looks as if it's straight out of the 1930s or 40s, I really enjoyed how even the backgrounds were highly detailed and animated. With a shoot-'em-up game such as this one, any and all things that can be seen as a distraction could make a tough game even tougher to deal with, but I didn't mind that at all. There definitely were moments where I found it difficult to concentrate due to the fact that this is a hard game, but I genuinely enjoyed all of the effort that went into making this game. It was to the point where I was left wanting to buy figures or general merchandise from this game. If your game can manage to make me want to spend more money than I already have, I'd say you did something right. Despite thinking that the overall art style of Cuphead is great, at times I felt that the old film reel appearance/effect used throughout the entire game got tiring to look at. I know that this was done to make it look as if it were truly from the 1930s or 40s, but I eventually wanted to do something about it. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it interfered with me playing the game, but it reminded me of when I'm watching decades-old movies on 4K. What I mean is that it's easy to notice a film's imperfections when grain or other on-screen noise is noticeable. I'm sure that some think that this adds to the overall viewing experience, but not to me. If anything, I think it would have been better had there been an option to turn this effect off or alter it in one way or another. It's how some remastered retro games approach things. Whether it be with adding artificial TV scan lines or some other effect that was more present decades ago, having the choice to alter things to how you prefer them is always a good thing. Being a jazz fan, you'd think that I'd have a ton to say about Cuphead's music, but I really don't. To some, that may be a bad thing, but I'd like to think that it's more due to the fact that Cuphead's music speaks for itself. Simply put, the music is great. It's primarily multiple different subgenres of jazz such as big band, bebop, and music that's more specific to the world you're currently in. The music is pretty much the highlight of what Cuphead has to offer in regards to its sound, but the sound design certainly does enough to stand out in more ways than one. I'm sure that Cuphead isn't the first or the last game to do this, but I really liked how some bosses made certain sounds prior to an attack. These tells work as a signal for you to evade, and on top of the visual cues that could be used in a similar way, this left me wanting to be as attentive as possible. The more I noticed about Cuphead's bosses and their habits, the better off I'd be. As I previously mentioned, Cuphead manages to do more than one thing really well. With its art style, animation, and music, its high quality is seen. Thankfully, the same could be said of Cuphead's gameplay. Maybe I just haven't played enough 2D run-and-gun platformers, but I was pleasantly surprised to see that the overall gameplay of Cuphead sure does vary. What I mean is that Cuphead could have easily leaned on its art style and animations while delivering bare-bones gameplay, but that's not the case here. Rather than simply making an alright run-and-gun platformer, it's clear that a lot of thought and effort went into making it so that just about every aspect of Cuphead is at a high level. In particular, I liked how the special abilities besides the default ones actually made a difference in Cuphead. I'd say that it really depends on your playstyle and the situation you happen to be in, but it's still nice being able to see for yourself what works best. Generally, for games such as this one, it's usually just about your own skills as a player, and that's why some speedrunners will flock to some games more than others, but in Cuphead it's a combination of both things. Don't get me wrong, realizing that my own faults as a player were what held me back and left me fighting some bosses for hours at a time was frustrating, but I also got some comfort from realizing that it also had to do with using ineffective abilities. I know that multi-directional aiming in a game such as Cuphead isn't groundbreaking, but it still stood out to me. Initially, I thought it was great because it offered a greater level of precision, but at times it felt slightly uncomfortable. What I mean is that it sometimes caused overlapping issues. For example, if I wanted to aim at 1 o'clock or at 11 o'clock, this would cause me to walk off into that direction, and I'd end up taking damage or dying. This happened every once in a while during some of the more conventional levels, but it was especially aggravating to deal with when this would occur in the middle of a boss fight. It was more likely to happen in boss fights because of how limited space was. This, among a few other reasons, was why I felt that a lot of the way things worked led to frequent and cheap deaths. I'd say that it was a mix between my own failings as a player and how the game was made. Even if this was annoying to deal with, part of me thought that it was appropriate because it went hand in hand with the overall story of Cuphead. What I mean is that it sometimes felt as if the house always wins. The following complaint makes sense, seeing as how you're falling off screen, but at the same time, I thought it was weird that falling off of high platforms would cause damage, even if there was a platform below you. I could see this being fair if it involved extreme heights, but that wasn't the case. This is really more of a nitpick, but these issues would eventually add up, and it made it so that getting through some areas of the game was harder than it needed to be. With how Cuphead pushes you to parry enemies and their attacks, you'd think that getting the hang of it would be more rewarding than it is. Don't get me wrong, you already benefit in more ways than one if you can successfully parry enemies and or their attacks, but I still thought that being damaged while being mid-air felt cheap. I realized that it'd be too unfair for you to more or less be invincible throughout the whole parry animation, but at the same time, I felt that parrying left you too vulnerable to attacks. I also thought it was a bit strange that parrying was limited to only a few enemies or attacks. I know that limits had to be placed on this ability or else it'd lead to combat being imbalanced, but I think the solution to that would be to make it so that landing a successful parry requires even more skill. I realize that bringing up Dark Souls in an unrelated game is old at this point, but it's because that game did so many things right. In Dark Souls, you can pretty much parry most of the general enemies you encounter. Rather than having limitations placed on you, it really depends on your skills. Simply put, the more control that I have over how the game is played, the happier I'll be. This really isn't a complaint, but I would have liked if Cuphead had featured additional game modes. I realize that including more could have led to the overall quality of the game suffering, but I don't think that would have happened because of how certain parts ended up. There was one minigame where you more or less had to parry over and over again. That got a bit stressful towards the end, but it was still fun. I could see that being a game mode if you were told to parry X number of times or try to parry for as long as possible. The point is that delivering more of what worked would have added to the overall value of Cuphead. Cuphead isn't one of the hardest games I've ever played, but certain parts definitely got me close to rage quitting. It's for that reason why I think that Cuphead is one of those games that takes a bit of time to get used to after days of not playing. I bring that up because it was easier to get in the zone the more time you spent with Cuphead. There definitely were moments where I spent more than 3 hours attempting to beat a single boss, and that was stressful, but it was easier to keep going because if I didn't, I'd have to get used to the boss, tactics, and tells. I'd say that it's more due to Cuphead simply being a fun game, but at the same time, my play sessions with it were pretty long due to my own stubbornness. If I could see that I was getting close to beating a boss, it was easy to stay put because it was simply a matter of when and not if I'd beat them. At the same time, it really depends on how you are as a person/gamer. I can put up with frustration for lengthy periods of time, but that may not be the case for some of you. As I mentioned before, certain parts of Cuphead left me thinking that they weren't as fair as they could have been. I don't think this is what the devs had in mind, but some parts of the game came off as if the devs were thinking, how can we make this harder than it needs to be? I bring this up because some levels weren't over until you crossed or reached their finish line. This was annoying because even if the end was clearly in sight, you'd have to continuously dodge projectiles until the very end as they'd still be able to cause damage or even kill you. Unfortunately, that happened to me more than once and it felt as if it had more to do with how the game was made rather than my own shortcomings as a gamer. Being able to advance through these levels at a later time made it clear that it was possible to beat them as they were, but I still thought that they were harder than they needed to be. I'm complaining about certain parts of Cuphead being harder than they needed to be because this added to the amount of time it took me to beat it. I realize that how long to beat mostly features averages and the time it takes some to beat a game won't apply to you, but it's still something I like to have in mind whenever I start up a new game. According to how long to beat, the average playthrough of Cuphead was around 8 hours, but it took me 17 hours. I'd say that around 5 to 6 hours were torture due to struggling to beat some of the bosses. The option to lower the difficulty level was always there, but for me, that's more or less the equivalent of throwing in the towel. I know that some choose to play on easy due to lack of time or simply wanting to experience a game's story without having to struggle, but I like to go through what devs mark as the default setting. I'd be lying if I said that it also wasn't due to bragging rights, but it's also because I prefer gaming experiences that are more towards the middle of the road. If it's too easy, chances are that I'm not getting to experience the game to its fullest extent. If it's too hard, then I'm most likely struggling to get through it, ending up frustrated, and I'll want to move on to avoid wasting time. Cuphead is definitely a hard game, and I know that I mentioned certain parts of it that came off as unfair to me, but overall, I'd say that it's a fair game. What I mean by fair is that just about every time I died, I knew what I did wrong. It was clear to me that I was capable of overcoming whichever situation I happened to be in, and when it comes to hard games, that's something you should aim for. If Cuphead were hard to the point where I had no idea how to move ahead, chances are I wouldn't have enjoyed it as much as I did. Before I started playing Cuphead, I expected it to feature more traditional levels. I was surprised to see that around 80% of the game was boss fights, but that wasn't a bad thing at all. What's good is that Cuphead gives you the opportunity to freely roam around the map, and as a result of that, you can decide when and how to approach levels and bosses. I don't think this is what the devs had in mind, but it reminded me of Mega Man. What I mean is that in Mega Man games you could decide how to approach which boss to fight and when. There was usually a more efficient way of doing things, but I'm sure that many gamers, much like myself, stuck to what was most comfortable for them. It wasn't entirely the same in Cuphead, seeing as how beating bosses didn't unlock abilities that made future fights easier to handle, but it still offered the ability to gain experience. If you could get through one boss and you learned how to approach them, you could take that knowledge to make future encounters easier to handle. Not only that, deciding which boss to fight and actually being able to beat them gave me confidence. If I couldn't beat one boss right from the start, at least I could get to them at a later time. I also like the inclusion of what I consider more traditional levels because they manage to offer multiple different things at once. What I mean is that these levels manage to come off as tutorials and challenges at the same time. It's because they pushed you out of your comfort zone, but they also made it so that certain techniques were favored over other ones. Even if this wasn't seen during multiple moments in one of these levels, it was still nice to notice that this was being done, such as when a shop coin was just out of reach for you, and the solution would be to parry off of an enemy to get to it, or simply think of a different approach. These levels and the boss fights themselves worked as teaching moments, and I like that. Despite having enjoyed how Cuphead was laid out as a game, I'm sure that many out there weren't happy that it's more or less one big boss rush mode. Many out there enjoy a challenge such as this one, but challenging boss fights that come one after another could be off-putting for some. To make things worse for people such as those, this isn't a game where you can blindly run and gun to get ahead. Tactics such as those can work in different games, but in Cuphead, the more pattern learning you do, the better off you'll be. I know that some can learn from a game without having to die, but I'm the kind of player that learns from their mistakes. They were more than I'd like to admit, but each death during a boss fight taught me what to avoid, how to attack, and how long it'd take to get through them. The inclusion of a progress bar in this game was a small touch, but it affected how I played. This really stood out to me because whenever I noticed that I was close to beating a boss, I felt motivated to keep at it. If I saw that I was having a hard time and I was nowhere near close to beating them, I'd usually reconsider what I was doing. This was usually done by exploring other parts of the area I was in, shopping for new items, or simply changing up my weapons/abilities loadout. Simply put, the more information you give a player, the better off they'll be. This isn't always the case, and it really depends on the situation, but with Cuphead, missing out on the progress bar probably would have made the boss fights even harder than they already were. It's true that one boss fight can lead to you learning something helpful that can be utilized in another, but not always. Depending on how frustrating a boss was, that usually leads to frustration, but not all the time. What I liked is that you can't go into each boss fight with the same mentality, and that makes for a very unique experience. Just about every boss fight is a unique experience, and even the different phases of a single boss can all be different to one another. At times, a single boss fight can come off as 2 or 3 different fights in one. That wasn't limited to a boss forms. On top of that, each attempt you made at beating a boss wasn't always the same. Sometimes the boss would start off with an attack that you initially expected to appear as the second phase, and that caught me off guard. It was sometimes a pain to deal with, but I still applauded that move because it prevented things from becoming too stale. It's possible to make it so that a player can quickly get familiarized with things to the point where a game becomes too easy for them, but where's the fun in that? Personally, I like it when challenges are done just right. If they're too over the top to the point where I find it hard to imagine myself advancing through them, I'm more likely to move on from that specific moment of a game or simply stop playing. Cuphead sometimes got close to that point, but I'd say things were generally okay. I'd say that it has more to do with me as a player than with how Cuphead was designed, but I still think that certain parts of it got me used to things being a specific way, and yet that wasn't always the case. I bring this up because a great deal of things can't be destroyed in levels or boss fights. I thought that was bothersome because you'll sometimes have projectiles flying at you during boss battles, and your only defense is to evade them. Some boss battles featured projectiles and or enemies that could be destroyed, but others didn't. What I'm saying is that I would have liked had this been approached differently. I realized that switching things up every once in a while was another way of keeping you on your toes, but approaching this in such a way made certain parts of Cuphead harder than they needed to be. I guess this ties in with how I feel about parrying. One of the reasons why Cuphead got a lot of attention back in 2017 was due to its level of difficulty. To some, it was too much to handle. For others, it was just right. I'm sure that this was done on purpose, as a way to ease in players into the game, but from the start I was able to accomplish more than I expected. I should have taken this for what it is, a small taste of what's to come, but it made me feel overconfident. At one point I started to think that I was simply way better than those that quickly gave up on Cuphead, and I'd say that's right, even if only to an extent, but it wasn't long before I realized how hard things would get. Based on my own experience, some bosses can literally take a dozen or more attempts to beat. I know that this happened more than once, but I also know that there were specific bosses that were simply harder to beat than the rest of them. One in particular took me around 4 hours to beat, and I can imagine some people would be annoyed with having to deal with that. With how I've described this, I'm sure that some will be turned away from even giving Cuphead a try, but it ultimately depends on what kind of a gamer/person you are. I definitely do have my limits, and the older I get, the less likely it'll be that I'll put up with stressful or infuriating moments in a game, but if there are more pros than cons, chances are that I'll put up with it. I bring this up because that's more or less how it was for me once I made it to the Devil's Casino. From how the story was put together, I assumed that I was at the end or close to it, so I predicted that it'd take me a day or so to beat Cuphead from that point in the game. I quickly realized that I was wrong. I don't know how much time it took me to advance from this point back in 2017, but my most recent playthrough of Cuphead showed me that it was more than I initially expected it'd be. At first, it wasn't because of the difficulty of the casino's mini-bosses, but because you were dealing with a gauntlet. I wouldn't go so far as to say that the casino was handled unfairly, but it still led to many frustrating moments. Honestly, how it was handled left me thinking that it was both good and bad. What I mean is that the casino was challenging to the point where it fit in with what the story was trying to convey, but being forced to start over and dealing with low health got to me more than once. What I'm saying is that Cuphead's the kind of game that takes your expectations and tosses them out the window. Sometimes that works in your favor, but other times it doesn't. Getting through the first phase of the casino without taking much damage was a hassle, but as if that wasn't bad enough, having to go from that straight to King Dice was a massive pain to deal with. I'm sure that more skilled players thought nothing of this, especially since it's possible to make things harder than they already were, but this tested my patience in more ways than one. With how some spoke of Cuphead's difficulty, I was happy with myself for not only being able to get through it, but also because I could beat some of the bosses on my first attempt. I realized that not rage quitting is something dumb to feel proud of, but that's what I occasionally had in mind while playing through Cuphead. Not only did it make me think that I'm a skilled player, but even in the face of adversity I was mature enough to collect myself and keep trying. That's how most of my experience with Cuphead was, but it didn't take long before King Dice got me to rage quit levels. With games such as this one, getting in the zone and keeping at it until you overcome whichever obstacle you're dealing with is usually the best strategy, but sometimes taking a day or two off helps to clear your mind. I was eager to beat Cuphead and move on to something else, but King Dice's difficulty made me realize that it'd take me longer than I could predict to get through him. Once I eventually did beat King Dice, I realized that it took me 4 hours to beat him. Doing that wasn't easy, but if anything, it made things easier for myself in the future. What I mean is that my recent playthrough of Cuphead was easier than I expected it to be. I realized that this being my second playthrough of Cuphead automatically makes it so that I'm at least familiar with certain things, but this is still the kind of game that's hard to get through even if you've already beaten it before. It's for that reason why I was surprised when I got an achievement thanks to beating King Dice in a specific way. Not only that, I ended up getting high rankings on all of the bosses in Hell. Getting to that point wasn't easy, but I bring it up because even if Cuphead is a hard game to get through, it's not impossible. That's true, but at times I was left thinking that I didn't know what's worse, not knowing how to beat a boss or knowing how to beat them and still not being able to. You think that the devil, Cuphead's final boss, would be the hardest one to get through, but if anything, the casino was much harder for me to deal with. It's the kind of game where success is inches away from your grasping fingers. The simple fact that I came back to Cuphead 4 years later and subjected myself to some of its more difficult bosses showcases what I think of it. Cuphead is the kind of game that offers something great in just about every single aspect it has to offer. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's a perfect game, but it's for sure a well-crafted one, and I loved it. If you think Cuphead might be too hard for you, I'd say that you should at least watch someone stream it or watch a playthrough of it. Its animations and overall art style are for sure a wonder to take in. If it isn't clear by now, I definitely recommend Cuphead. It's not the hardest game I've ever played, but it's a difficult one that's able to motivate you to keep playing thanks to how well made it is. If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching,